The fluorescent lights of the office hummed, a sterile sound that usually faded into the background noise of my life. But today, it felt like a physical pressure, pushing down on me, on the slick, official envelope in my hands. The paper felt too crisp, too final. My name was typed neatly on the front, but the address below was wrong. It was addressed to me, yes, but at a legal firm I didn't recognize, somewhere downtown, miles from my predictable suburban street. My heart started a slow, heavy thud against my ribs, a sound that filled the sudden silence in my small, orderly world. I tore open the envelope, the sound ripping through the quiet office like a scream I couldn't make. Inside, more legal documents. Page after page of dense text, corporate letterheads, signatures I didn't recognize. My eyes scanned, desperate for a landmark, a name, anything familiar in this sea of legalese. Then I saw it. A property address. The lake house. My family's lake house. And below it, the words quitclaim deed, and below that, two names. His. And hers. Mark. And Sarah Miller. The air left my lungs in a rush. The humming lights seemed to flicker and die, plunging me into a sudden, internal darkness. Mark, my husband of 12 years. Sarah, the woman I knew he was sleeping with, the open secret that festered between us like a slow poison. But the lake house? The lake house wasn't just a property. It was generations of my family's history, summer nights and scraped knees, my grandmother's rocking chair on the porch, the specific way the light hit the water at dawn. It was sacred, and he had given it away. To her. The document felt heavy, like a stone in my hands. A stone dropped into the calm waters of my life, sending out ripples that would become tidal waves. It wasn't just about a house. It was about a betrayal so profound, so carelessly cruel, it rearranged the landscape of my reality. My hands started to shake, the crisp paper rustling like dead leaves. The sterile office, the humming lights, my neat desk. None of it felt real anymore. Only the burning in my chest, the shock that was rapidly curdling into something cold and hard. He hadn't just broken his vows, he had desecrated my history. Let me know where you're watching from and what time it is. And if you haven't already, please subscribe, it helps me more than you know. The lake house. Even the name tasted like sunshine and pine needles on my tongue. It wasn't grand. It was weathered wood and mismatched furniture, floors that creaked in predictable places, a screen door that slammed with a familiar bang. It sat on 3 acres of tangled woods that sloped down to a small, private lake. My great-grandfather had built it, clearing the land with his own hands. My grandmother had taught me to swim off the rickety dock, the water cold and clean. My father had taken me fishing there, patiently untangling my lines more often than I actually caught anything. It was the backdrop to every happy memory I held of my family, a quiet constant in a changing world. Growing up, summers were a pilgrimage. Leaving the city dust behind, driving north, the air growing cleaner, the trees thicker. The first glimpse of the lake through the trees always felt like coming home, a deeper, truer home than the one with a foundation of brick and mortar. It was a place of belonging, of peace. When my parents passed, the house passed to me. It wasn't a financial asset, it was a trust, a legacy. I never considered selling it, not ever. It was where I planned to bring my own children one day, where I would grow old watching the seasons turn on the water. My marriage to Mark had been comfortable. We met in college, built a life piece by predictable piece. Good jobs, a nice apartment that became a nice starter house. We talked about the future, kids, maybe a bigger house, travel. The lake house was always part of that picture, the tranquil retreat waiting for us, for our hypothetical family. Mark liked the lake house. He enjoyed weekends there, learned to fish, even helped with some repairs. I thought he loved it too, not with the deep, ancestral love I felt, but with the appreciation of a peaceful escape. I showed him the old photo albums, told him the stories. He seemed to listen. He seemed to care. There were cracks, of course. Small ones, at first, like hairline fractures you don't notice until the wall is about to crumble. Late nights at work that stretched into early mornings. A growing distance between us, a quietness that wasn't peaceful but empty. My friends tried to tell me, gently, with worried eyes. Whispers reached me, the kind you pretend not to hear but that settle deep in your gut. Sarah Miller, younger, vivacious, worked in Mark's company. I saw her once at a company picnic, all bright smiles and easy laughter. I dismissed the whispers, the feeling in my gut. Our life was solid, wasn't it? We had plans. We had the lake house. The day the envelope arrived, the carefully constructed facade of my life didn't just crack, it shattered. I sat there, in the sterile light, the names Mark and Sarah Miller blurring on the page. He hadn't just betrayed our vows, he had stolen my past, present, and future. He had taken the most precious, most irreplaceable piece of my inheritance, my history, my soul's anchor, and given it to the woman he was having an affair with. It wasn't about money. It was an act of utter desecration, an act of war. My first instinct was disbelief. This had to be a mistake, a legal error. Mark couldn't do this. He wouldn't do this. I called him, my voice trembling, clutching the papers. Mark, I managed. What is this? This thing about the lake house. His voice on the phone was measured, too calm. That. Yeah, I needed to talk to you about that. Needed to talk to me? After the fact? After signing it over? It's complicated, honey. Complicated. That's what he called signing away my family's legacy to his mistress. My breath hitched. Complicated? Mark, you gave away the lake house. My lake house. To her. There was a pause. A beat of silence that felt like an eternity. Then his voice hardened. Look, I needed to make a clean break. Things with Sarah are serious. We need a place. The lake house was the easiest asset to transfer quickly. Easiest asset. My inheritance. My history. An asset. Quickly. To his mistress. The words felt like blows. Easiest? It wasn't yours to give, Mark. It's been in my family for 4 generations. Well, legally, it was community property, he countered, his tone defensive now. And besides, you weren't using it that much. It needed work. Sarah loves it. We're going to fix it up. He wasn't using it that much? It needed work? Sarah loves it? The sheer audacity of it stole my voice. He was justifying giving away my history, my sanctuary, to the woman he was betraying me with by saying I didn't appreciate it enough, and she did? He was talking about renovating my grandmother's house with his mistress, making new memories over the graves of mine. Something snapped inside me. The trembling stopped. The cold, hard feeling solidified, spreading from my chest through my limbs. You did this. I whispered, the sound flat and dead. You actually did this. It's done, he said, his voice dismissive now. Look, I'll make it up to you. We'll figure out the finances. We can talk divorce settlement. Divorce settlement. He was already there. Already moving on, parceling out our life like unwanted leftovers, starting with the most valuable, most emotionally significant piece, and giving it to her. There was no remorse, no apology, just a chilling practicality. He had already mentally divorced me, moved on, and was now just handling the messy paperwork. I hung up the phone, my hand shaking again, but this time with a cold, quiet rage. I didn't scream. I didn't cry. I sat there, surrounded by the humming silence of my office, and felt the last vestiges of my old life fall away like ash. My marriage, my trust, the future I thought I had gone, replaced by a vast, echoing emptiness filled only with the names Mark and Sarah Miller and the image of them in my lake house. Initial attempts to challenge the transfer were futile. I consulted lawyers, my voice thin and reedy as I recounted the story, showing them the deed. They shook their heads, sympathetic but firm. A quitclaim deed, properly executed, is difficult to reverse, especially when transferring between spouses. Even if one spouse wasn't informed or consenting, the legal loophole was often there if the other spouse had any claim to the asset's value increased during the marriage, or if it was held in certain ways. Community property laws were complicated. It would be a long, expensive legal battle with no guarantee of success. And while the battle raged, they would be there, in my house, making it theirs. The thought of them touching my grandmother's things, repainting the walls I'd stared at as a child, laughing on the porch swing where my parents had courted, was unbearable. It wasn't just a legal fight, it was a violation, a desecration. Every legal setback felt like another twist of the knife. Papers arrived detailing their plans for renovation. A new dock, expanding the deck, modernizing the kitchen, taking the worn, beloved place of my childhood and turning it into their sleek, new monument to betrayal. I drove up there once, parked down the road where I wouldn't be seen. I walked through the woods, the familiar scent of pine and damp earth doing nothing to soothe the ache in my chest. I stood hidden among the trees and watched them. Sarah, laughing, pointing at something on the roof. Mark, with his arm around her, smiling. They looked happy. They looked like they belonged. In my place. It felt like watching someone else live my life, wear my skin, stand on my sacred ground. That's when the tears finally came, hot and bitter. Tears of grief, not just for the house, but for the life I thought I had, the man I thought I knew. The pain was a physical weight, crushing me. I slumped against a rough tree trunk, gasping for air, feeling utterly defeated. They had won. They had taken the most valuable thing I had, the one thing that wasn't about money, and they were getting away with it. The legal system was a slow, indifferent machine. They had already settled into their stolen life, while I was left with the dust and the echoes. Weeks turned into months. The initial shock wore off, replaced by a dull, persistent ache. Divorce proceedings began, a dreary process of dividing assets that suddenly felt meaningless. The house was the only thing that mattered, and it was gone. I went through the motions, polite, quiet. Mark seemed relieved, almost cheerful, free from the constraints of our marriage. He brought Sarah to meetings, their presence a deliberate, calculated cruelty. They were building their future on the ruins of mine. The ache festered, turning inward. It wasn't just sadness anymore. It was resentment, cold and hard, building like ice around my heart. I saw their renovation plans, the permits filed, the contractors coming and going. They were pouring money into the place, making it more and more theirs. And the more they invested, the further it felt from me, from my history. It was becoming irrevocably their house. One evening, staring blankly at a spreadsheet of joint assets Mark's lawyer had sent, my eyes unfocused, something shifted. I saw the value listed for the lake house. A number. A cold, financial figure attached to something that was priceless to me. And I thought about all the money they were pouring into it now, increasing that number, increasing its market value. They were building something valuable. Something they could eventually sell, profit from, move on from, leaving no trace of me behind. And then it hit me. A thought so cold, so sharp, it sliced through the fog of grief and pain. I couldn't fight for the house as it was. I couldn't get back the peeling paint, the creaky floors, the ghosts of happy memories. That version was gone, perhaps forever. But what if I wasn't trying to get the house back? What if I was trying to make them regret taking it? What if I could turn their victory into their ruin? The idea was a seed, dark and twisted, planted in the fertile ground of my despair. It grew quickly, pushing aside the last shoots of hope and nostalgia. If the house, in their hands, was simply an asset, then its value was its vulnerability. What if that value disappeared? Not just a little dip in the market, but a complete, catastrophic implosion. My focus shifted. I stopped looking at old photos. I stopped driving by the lake. I started researching. Not divorce law, but property law. Environmental regulations. Zoning ordinances. Local government procedures. My grief transformed into a cold, relentless energy. I spent hours in libraries, online databases, poring over land surveys, property records, historical documents related to the area around the lake. The land had been in my family for generations, yes, but there were details I hadn't paid attention to, things my father or grandfather might have known but never articulated as formal knowledge. Things buried deep in old town records, forgotten planning commission meetings, Dusty geological surveys. I found a reference to a small, defunct industrial operation that had been located a mile or so upstream on a creek that fed the lake, decades ago. A tannery long gone. Modern environmental laws were strict about potential downstream contamination. I found old geological surveys showing a specific soil composition on my family's property, bordering the creek. I cross-referenced this with current environmental agency guidelines. There were triggers, specific contaminants, soil types that required mandatory investigation if potential sources were identified nearby. I found records of old easements, rights of way granted across parts of the property decades ago for utility access, long forgotten. One in particular was tied to a potential future municipal water line expansion that had stalled. But the easement was still legally valid, and its wording was broad enough to potentially complicate future development or even impact mortgage eligibility if rigorously enforced or interpreted. I learned about zoning. The lake properties were currently zoned residential, but adjacent parcels, further from the water, had different zoning designations. I looked into the history of zoning hearings, local politics, the specific members of the Planning Commission. Zoning laws weren't static. They could be petitioned, debated, changed. A change in zoning on an adjacent property could significantly impact the perceived value and future use of a residential parcel, especially one dependent on preserving a certain aesthetic and peaceful environment. My life became a double life. By day, I was the quiet, composed woman going through a difficult divorce. By night, I was a strategist, a researcher, building a complex web of legal and environmental vulnerabilities around the lake house like a spider spinning a deadly, invisible trap. My office, once a symbol of my predictable life, became my war room. Piles of documents replaced neat stacks of papers. Maps were spread across the floor. Legal pads filled with scribbled notes and potential angles. The research was painstaking, requiring patience and a willingness to delve into dry, technical details. But every obscure fact I uncovered, every potential loophole, every environmental regulation, felt like another piece of ammunition. I wasn't motivated by simple revenge anymore. It was colder, more calculated. This was about reclamation, not just of the property, but of my power, my sense of agency that Mark had stolen. I hired new consultants, not divorce lawyers this time, but environmental consultants, land use experts, even a private investigator to gather information discreetly. I didn't tell them the full story, just framed it as due diligence regarding potential future property investments or concerns about regional development. I paid them handsomely, draining my savings, taking out a loan. This wasn't a cheap undertaking. It was a massive financial risk. But the house wasn't about money, remember? The point wasn't to save money. It was to destroy their investment. The deeper I got, the clearer the strategy became. I needed to make the property a liability. I needed to create problems that would cost Mark and Sarah vast sums of money to address, problems that would make the property undesirable, perhaps even unsellable, to anyone but someone with intimate knowledge of its history and a long-term view. Someone like me. Phase 1. The environmental issue. I anonymously, through a shell company I created with layers of legal protection, filed a formal request with the state environmental agency for an investigation into potential historical contamination upstream from the lake. I provided the specific historical records I'd found, the geological survey data, the location of Mark and Sarah's property downstream. I knew enough to phrase the request in a way that would trigger a mandatory preliminary assessment. This wouldn't immediately identify contamination on their property, but it would flag the area, require testing, and immediately complicate any property transactions or financing. Banks get very nervous about potential environmental liabilities. Phase 2. The legal encumbrances. I worked with a sharp, discreet property lawyer I found through my research, someone who specialized in complex land use issues. Again, I gave him a carefully constructed version of the truth. We activated the old, obscure easement. We didn't block access, not yet, but we clarified its terms, asserted the rights of the easement holder, which, through a series of legal steps, I now indirectly controlled, making it clear that any significant renovations or changes to the property's layout could be challenged under the easement's terms. This created legal uncertainty, another red flag for banks and potential buyers. Phase 3. The zoning maneuver. This was the longest play. I started attending local planning commission meetings, initially just listening, observing. I spoke to people in the town, residents concerned about growth, conservationists worried about the lake's ecosystem. I quietly supported initiatives that would limit development, tighten building codes, and increase buffer zones around the water. I didn't directly target Mark and Sarah's property, but I advocated for changes to adjacent zoning that would make their parcel feel less like a desirable, isolated retreat and more like a residential island potentially surrounded by less appealing zoning in the future. This required patience, persistence, and understanding the subtle dynamics of local politics. Each step was a calculated risk. I was spending money I could ill afford. I was operating in a legal gray area, technically within my rights, but with intentions that were far from innocent. The stress was immense, a constant knot in my stomach. There were moments of doubt, late nights staring at the ceiling, wondering if I had gone too far, if the cost was too high, if I was becoming as ruthless as the man who had hurt me. But then I would think of Mark and Sarah, in my grandmother's house, building their life on my stolen history, and the cold resolve would return. Mark and Sarah were aware of some of the issues starting to surface. The environmental agency sent letters. The easement lawyer sent notices. The Planning Commission held hearings that discussed zoning changes potentially impacting their area. Mark called me a few times, angry and confused. "What's going on with the property? We're getting all these notices. Is this something you know about?" I kept my voice neutral, calm. "Mark, I'm not involved in anything to do with the lake house property anymore. You made that clear when you gave it away. Environmental regulations, easements, zoning. That's all standard process. Maybe you should have looked into that before you acquired the property." My dry humor was a thin veil for the simmering satisfaction underneath. He sputtered, frustrated. But these seem targeted. This environmental thing came out of nowhere. And this easement lawyer. It's ridiculous. Is it? I asked softly. Maybe the property wasn't as simple an asset as you thought. He hung up, clearly frustrated. He didn't suspect me, not really. He thought it was bad luck, bureaucracy, maybe even someone else in the family stirring up trouble. He couldn't conceive that the quiet, passive woman he had discarded could be capable of orchestrating such a complex, deliberate attack. That was his fatal flaw. He underestimated me. The deepening crisis wasn't just external, it was internal. My plan was working. The environmental assessment triggered mandatory soil and water testing on the property, a costly process with uncertain outcomes. The easement was now a confirmed encumbrance, complicating their ability to get a clear title report for refinancing or future sale. The zoning changes were moving through the approval process, creating a cloud of uncertainty over the area's future value. Contractors they had hired started pulling out, nervous about the environmental flags and legal issues. Their attempts to get a construction loan or refinance their existing mortgage hit roadblocks. The bank wanted assurances about the environmental status and a clear understanding of the easement's impact. Suddenly, the asset Mark had so carelessly given away was becoming a financial albatross. I watched from a distance, gathering information through public records, online news reports about town meetings, and discreet inquiries via my consultants. The renovation stalled. Supplies sat unused. The optimistic energy around the house dissipated, replaced by a palpable tension, even from afar. The pressure built for them. The testing costs mounted. The environmental agency's timelines stretched out, leaving them in limbo. The bank grew impatient. Mark, used to easy wins and smooth deals, was floundering. He couldn't charm his way out of environmental regulations or illegal easements. Sarah, who had envisioned a glamorous lakeside retreat, was now facing a potential money pit burdened with legal problems. Their relationship, built on Mark's betrayal and Sarah's ambition, began to fray under the strain. The legal process of our divorce concluded. The financial settlement was finalized. It was fair, even generous on paper, but it felt hollow. The real prize, the house, was still theirs, albeit a tarnished, problematic version. But the stage was set. The value was plummeting. The property was becoming toxic to them. The final turning point came when the environmental agency released its preliminary findings. While not confirming major contamination yet, the report indicated the need for extensive, costly further investigation and potential remediation, citing the historical tannery upstream and the specific soil conditions on the property. Simultaneously, the bank that held their mortgage issued a formal notice. Due to the environmental concerns, the encumbrance from the easement, and the uncertainty of the zoning situation, the property was no longer considered sufficient collateral for the outstanding loan amount. They were given a deadline to provide additional collateral or face foreclosure. This was it, the culmination of months of planning, risk, and cold determination. They were trapped. The property was a massive liability, costing them money and stress, impossible to sell at anything close to what they owed or had invested, and now facing potential foreclosure. They had taken my sacred space and turned it into a poisoned well. And I was the only one who knew the antidote. I initiated the final phase. Through my anonymous shell company, I contacted the bank holding their mortgage. I expressed interest in acquiring the distress loan, or potentially the property if it went to auction. I presented myself as a third-party investor interested in properties with complex issues, hinting that I had specific knowledge or resources to handle the environmental and legal hurdles. This signaled to the bank that there was a potential buyer, someone willing to deal with the mess, which made them more likely to push for a quick resolution rather than a lengthy, uncertain foreclosure process. Simultaneously, I had my property lawyer send a formal letter to Mark and Sarah via their lawyer. It stated that the easement holder, my shell company, was willing to negotiate a resolution regarding the easement issues and also, as a separate matter, potentially discuss a purchase of the property, contingent on the environmental issues being factored into the price. The offer I floated was ridiculously low, a fraction of what they owed, reflecting the property's now severely damaged market value. The trap was fully sprung. They were bleeding financially, stressed, and facing foreclosure. The bank was pushing. And suddenly, there was a potential way out, albeit a painful one: sell to the mysterious party offering pennies on the dollar. Mark called me, his voice not angry this time, but frantic. Desperate.
You.
This is you, isn't it? He accused, the realization dawning in his voice. All of this. The environmental reports, the easement challenges, the bank. This is your doing. I smiled, a cold, thin smile he couldn't see. Mark, as I said, I'm not involved with that property. However, I paused, letting the silence hang. I have heard rumors. It seems the property you acquired isn't quite the asset you thought it was. But why? His voice cracked. Why would you do this? Destroy the value? It makes no sense, doesn't it? I asked softly, my voice devoid of emotion. You took something priceless from me and treated it like a disposable commodity. You gave away my history to build your future. You desecrated a place that was sacred to me. Did you really think there wouldn't be consequences? Consequences, he yelled, his voice rising in pitch, raw with panic. You've destroyed everything. We're ruined. The property is worthless. The bank is going to foreclose. How does this help you? You've just destroyed your own family's legacy, too. And here it was. The climax. The moment I had planned for, sacrificed for, waited for. I took a deep breath, the coldness in my voice absolute. That's where you're wrong, Mark. The property is worthless to you. Because you don't understand it. You didn't know its history, its secrets, its true vulnerabilities, and its true potential. His screaming started then, truly screaming, a sound of pure, unadulterated rage and despair. Potential. What potential? It's poisoned. It's legally encumbered. The zoning is a disaster. It's unsellable. It is, I agreed calmly. To anyone who isn't me. I laid it out for him, piece by meticulous piece. I knew about the old tannery and the specific soil because my great-grandfather had kept detailed journals, mentioning informal agreements and even burying certain less-than-ideal waste materials away from the house site on a specific, limited corner of the property, he later had tested himself, finding low levels of specific contaminants, but deeming it contained and manageable with specific, non-standard methods he devised. Methods I had rediscovered in his journals. The environmental report had flagged the potential, triggering mandatory investigation, but the true extent and localized nature of the issue, and the specific, relatively inexpensive remediation methods that could address it, were known only to someone with access to that lost family knowledge. Someone like me. The easement? My grandfather had granted it, but he had also included a clause in the original filing that gave the original grantor family, my family, specific rights to negotiate its terms or even buy it back under certain conditions if the property ever faced foreclosure or was sold significantly below market value due to encumbrances. A clause I had quietly exercised through my shell company. The zoning? I hadn't just supported changes. I had researched the process for reverting zoning, finding a specific path tied to long-term family ownership and conservation status. A path I could pursue once the property was back in my family's hands. You see, Mark, I explained, each word deliberate, slicing through his screams, you took an asset without understanding its foundation. You took something with deep roots and hidden complexities. You thought it was a simple transaction. But my family's history on that land is woven into its very fabric, its deeds, its potential liabilities, and its potential salvation. You didn't steal a house. You stole a puzzle you had no idea how to solve. His screaming stopped abruptly, replaced by stunned silence. He was processing the depth of his own ignorance, the intricate trap he had walked into. I made the property worthless to you, I repeated, reinforcing the plot twist. So worthless that the bank is forcing a sale. And who do you think is the only interested buyer, the only one who sees not just the problems I highlighted, but the solutions only I possess? The shell company that wants to buy the distressed loan or bid at auction. That's me, Mark. I tanked the value, so I could afford to buy it back, clearing out the debt you put on it, leveraging the very problems I created, using the loopholes tied to my family's history that you were oblivious to. You gave it away for free, loaded it with debt and liabilities, and now I will buy it back for pennies, and you and Sarah will be left with nothing but the debt you incurred trying to save a poisoned asset. The silence stretched, heavy with the weight of his ruined plan, his devastating realization. He had tried to erase me, take my history, and build his future. Instead, he had handed me the tools to reclaim it, stronger and more securely than before, while dismantling his own life in the process. He tried to speak, but only a choked sound came out. The confident, dismissive man who had called the lake house an easiest asset was gone, replaced by a broken, blind-sided fool. The aftermath wasn't a sudden relief, but a slow, weary process. The bank forced the sale. My shell company, through a prearranged agreement, acquired the property at a fraction of its former market value, effectively wiping out Mark and Sarah's investment and leaving them with potentially significant debt related to the failed renovations and testing costs. There was no dramatic courtroom showdown, just the quiet, cold finality of legal documents. I stood on the shore of the lake again, months later. The house looked neglected. The stalled renovations were an eyesore. The air felt heavy, not with pine and sunshine, but with the ghosts of conflict and decay. It wasn't the sacred place of my memories anymore. It was a battleground, scarred and wounded. But it was mine again.
Legali, unequivocali mine.
The environmental remediation, guided by the specific knowledge from my great-grandfather's journals and implemented with the right experts I'd quietly lined up, was less complex and expensive than the initial report suggested. The easement negotiation, now that I controlled both the property and the easement rights, through legal maneuvers I orchestrated, was simplified to a matter of formality. The zoning process would take time, but the path was clear. The house needed work. Extensive work. Not just fixing the peeling paint and creaky floors, but repairing the damage, literal and metaphorical, inflicted by Mark and Sarah's brief, destructive ownership and my own strategic demolition of its value. It was a daunting task, requiring time, money, and emotional strength. Standing there, I didn't feel triumphant. There was a cold satisfaction. Yes, the deep, bone-weary knowledge that I had faced down betrayal and reclaimed what was mine on my own terms. I had turned their weapon against them, using their greed and ignorance to achieve a victory I couldn't have won through conventional means. But there was also a profound sadness. The marriage was gone, irrevocably shattered. The innocence of my childhood memories tied to this place was tainted by the ugliness of the fight. I had won the battle, but I had paid a heavy price in trust and peace of mind. The lake was still there, the water still clear, reflecting the sky. The woods still smelled of pine and damp earth. The underlying beauty, the essence of the place, was still present, waiting to be uncovered again. I didn't know if I could ever make it feel like home again, not the effortless, peaceful home of my past. Maybe it would always carry the scars of this war. But it was mine, and I would heal it, just as I was learning, slowly, painfully, to heal myself. I looked at the weathered wood, the silent windows, and felt a new kind of connection, not just to the past, but to the future. A future I had fought for, strategically, ruthlessly, and ultimately successfully. The house, like me, had been damaged, betrayed, and then reclaimed. We would rebuild together. If this story hit close to home, I'd love to hear your version in the comments. Thanks for being here. Subscribing helps bring more of these to life.